A crowd of 2,000 people had gathered, their eyes fixed on the gallows where America's most infamous criminal was about to meet his end. The man standing there didn't fit the image of a murderer. He was sharply dressed, spoke with eloquence, and had spent his last days teaching Latin and Greek to other inmates. Yet, as the rope was tightened around his neck, Edward Howard Rulloff uttered words that would send chills down the spine of everyone present. "Hurry it up. I want to be in hell in time for dinner." The silence that followed was heavy. This wasn't the regretful plea of a man broken by guilt. It was the bold, almost mocking declaration of someone who saw himself as above everyone else, even as he faced death. The executioner did his job, and the man known as the most brilliant serial killer in America's history dropped into the unknown. What makes this story so disturbing is not just the crimes, but the mind behind them. Edward Rulloff's brain was one of the largest ever documented, 1673 cubic centimeters of sheer intellect. He was fluent in several languages, made significant contributions to the study of linguistics, and could have easily become a renowned scholar. Instead, he used his extraordinary intelligence to orchestrate murders he believed were flawless. After his execution, doctors removed his brain and found it was even larger than Einstein's, a fact that would puzzle scientists for years. This enormous brain had belonged to a man who killed his own wife and infant daughter, then spent years manipulating everyone around him. Judge Ransom Balcom had warned the authorities long before. "This man knows his rights better than you do and will fight for them until the end." He was right. Rulloff's intelligence didn't make him a gift to the world. It made him one of its most dangerous threats. Today, we're going to explore the chilling true story of the genius killer, a man whose intellect became his deadliest weapon, and whose brain still sits preserved in a jar at Cornell University. It's a stark reminder that intelligence without a conscience can create monsters. Edward Howard Rulloff was born around 1819 in New Brunswick, Canada, to Danish immigrant parents. From a young age it was clear he was different. He picked up languages with ease, Latin, Greek, German, absorbing them as naturally as breathing. But intelligence, when not guided by morality, can be more dangerous than ignorance. By the time he was 20, Edward had already seen both sides of the law. He worked at a law firm, but also spent 2 years in prison for embezzlement. That first brush with crime taught him something crucial. The rules of society were for ordinary people, not for someone as gifted as he believed himself to be. In 1842, looking for a fresh start, Edward moved to upstate New York and settled in the small town of Dryden. He presented himself as a schoolteacher, a respectable job that gave him the perfect cover for his real interests. But teaching wasn't enough for Edward. He began studying botanical medicine under Dr. Henry Bull, learning about plants, herbs, and, most importantly, poisons. Through Dr. Bull, Edward met Harriet Shutt, the doctor's 17-year-old cousin. Harriet's family was immediately wary of Edward. There was something off about his charm. It felt rehearsed, as if he was playing a part rather than showing real emotion. Despite her family's warnings, Harriet was drawn to Edward's intellect and sophistication. In 1843, against everyone's advice, Harriet married Edward. They moved to Lansing, New York, and soon welcomed a daughter, Priscilla. For a short time, it seemed like family life might settle Edward's darker urges, but normalcy was never something he could accept for long. As 1844 went on, Edward grew more and more dissatisfied with their modest life. He obsessed over bigger dreams, becoming a university professor, writing groundbreaking books, earning the recognition he felt he deserved. He pressured Harriet to move to Ohio, convinced that better opportunities awaited them there. But Harriet, now a mother, refused to leave her family behind. Her refusal triggered something violent in Edward. How could his less intelligent wife challenge his superior judgment? Neighbors started noticing troubling changes in the Rulloff household. Edward's charm became brittle and forced. Harriet seemed withdrawn and often had unexplained bruises. Their baby, Priscilla, was frequently sick and irritable. Everything came to a head on June 22, 1844. Edward confronted Harriet one last time about moving to Ohio when she refused. He flew into a rage, accusing her of being unfaithful with Dr. Bull. As Harriet worked in the kitchen, crushing peppercorns with a heavy iron pestle, Edward's anger boiled over. He snatched the pestle from her and struck her on the head with brutal force. Harriet collapsed, blood pooling beneath her. In that instant, Edward crossed a line he could never return from. But instead of panicking, his mind switched to problem-solving mode. He had a crisis to manage, and his intelligence would help him do it. 3-month-old Priscilla began crying in her crib, a witness who couldn't be silenced with words. While Edward never outright confessed to killing the baby, he later admitted to giving her something to make her stop crying. The baby went quiet, and Edward was left alone with two bodies and the urgent need to cover up his crime. The next morning, Edward's calculating nature took over. He went to his neighbors, the Andersons, and asked to borrow their horse and wagon, saying he needed to return a wooden chest to his uncle. The Andersons watched as Edward loaded the chest and a heavy sack into the wagon. He claimed he was heading east, but they saw him going toward Cayuga Lake in the opposite direction. Hours later, Edward returned. The chest was still there, but the sack was gone. He acted cheerful, telling everyone that he and Harriet would be away for a few weeks. For several days, Edward kept up the act. He taught his classes, chatted with townsfolk, and showed no sign of distress. His ability to compartmentalize was astonishing. He could discuss philosophy and literature, all while knowing his wife's body was hidden beneath the dark waters of Cayuga Lake. But Harriet's family grew suspicious when they heard nothing from her after Edward's announcement of their trip. When they came to check on the couple, they found the house in chaos. Harriet's clothes, jewelry, and personal items were all still there, things she would never have left behind. When Harriet's worried relatives pressed Edward for details about their sudden departure, his carefully crafted lies began to unravel. First, he claimed Harriet had left him. Then, he insisted they had moved to Ohio together. Each story contradicted the last, and none of them made sense. Realizing his deception was falling apart, Edward made a desperate choice. He ran, but he underestimated the determination of Harriet's family. Her brother Ephraim, driven by love for his sister and a deep suspicion of Edward, organized a relentless search. Eventually, Edward was caught and brought back to Ithaca to stand trial. However, the prosecution faced a major obstacle. Despite extensive searches of Cayuga Lake, no bodies were ever found. Edward, confident in his own intellect, chose to represent himself in court. His defense was simple but effective. Without physical evidence, how could anyone prove a crime had even occurred? The jury, swayed by Edward's persuasive arguments and the lack of bodies, reached a compromise. Unable to convict him of murder, they found him guilty of kidnapping his wife. In 1846, Edward was sentenced to 10 years in Auburn prison. Prison, rather than breaking Edward, became a sanctuary for his mind. Instead of being crushed by confinement, he used the time to pursue his true passion, the study of language. He immersed himself in philology, convinced he had discovered revolutionary principles that would change the scholarly world forever. He planned to publish his findings as the great secret in philology, believing it would be his greatest intellectual achievement. Edward was certain he had uncovered truths about language evolution that had eluded even the most respected academics. Recognizing his exceptional abilities, prison officials granted Edward unusual privileges. He was allowed to teach other inmates Latin and Greek, holding lessons in his own cell. The irony was striking. The same mind that had orchestrated his family's murders was now being celebrated for its academic contributions. But as Edward's release date approached, authorities delivered devastating news. The moment he was freed, new murder charges would be filed against him. Edward immediately invoked double jeopardy, launching a sophisticated legal battle from his cell. The district attorney, realizing Edward's argument regarding Harriet's murder was strong, dropped all charges related to her death, but he quickly filed new charges for the murder of baby Priscilla, since the infant had never been included in the original kidnapping case. No double jeopardy protections applied. In 1858, Edward was convicted of murdering his daughter and sentenced to death. During his years in prison, Edward had cultivated relationships with key people in the legal system, including Albert Jarvis, the undersheriff's son, whom Edward had tutored in classical languages. Whether through Jarvis's help or his own cunning, Edward managed to escape before his execution. He fled west on foot, surviving on stolen food and wild nuts, and eventually lost 2 toes to frostbite. The brilliant scholar had become a desperate fugitive, reduced to scavenging in the wilderness. When Edward reached Meadville, Pennsylvania, he reinvented himself once again. Using the alias James Nelson, he impressed local inventor A.B. Richmond with his vast knowledge of subjects ranging from geology to biology to forensic science. Richmond was so impressed that he offered Edward a business partnership. In Meadville, Edward finally achieved what he had always wanted: respect and recognition as an intellectual. But this success led to an even greater opportunity. Jefferson College in southwestern Pennsylvania offered him a professorship, the academic position he had always dreamed of. Just as Edward was on the verge of achieving everything he had ever wanted, his past caught up with him. Albert Jarvis, the undersheriff's son who had helped Edward escape, contacted him with a demand. Jarvis and his mother were now destitute and threatened to expose Edward's true identity unless he gave them money. Faced with the risk of exposure, Edward made a choice that revealed his true nature. He turned to robbery. He robbed a jewelry store, intending to give the money to the Jarvises, but was caught and sent back to New York to face justice. What happened next was almost unbelievable. Despite being a convicted murderer, escaped fugitive, and now a robber, Edward successfully appealed his conviction and was released when authorities decided not to prosecute him further. Free once again, Edward reunited with Albert Jarvis in New York City, where they survived as professional burglars. In 1861, Edward was arrested again and sent to prison, where he met his next criminal partner, William Dexter. Even behind bars, Edward continued his linguistic research. In 1869, he learned about the first convention of the American Philological Association and submitted a paper under the pseudonym Professor Rulloff. He offered to sell his research for $500,000, convinced his discoveries would revolutionize linguistics, but the academic community rejected his theories outright. No one even bid on his manuscript. This rejection crushed Edward's last hope for legitimate success and recognition. The scholarly world had turned its back on him completely, with his dreams of academic glory shattered. Edward devoted himself entirely to crime. Along with Jarvis and Dexter, he planned what he believed would be the perfect robbery. Their target was a dry goods store in Binghamton, New York. Two clerks, Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs, lived above the shop. Edward's plan was meticulous. They would use chloroform to keep the clerks unconscious while they looted the store. He studied the building, observed the clerks' routines, and developed what he thought was a foolproof strategy. But Edward's greatest strength, his intelligence, had become his greatest weakness. Years of success had made him dangerously overconfident. He believed he was untouchable. It was just after midnight on August 17, 1870, when everything began to unravel. As Edward, Jarvis, and Dexter crept through the darkened store, a simple mistake changed everything. Jarvis accidentally tripped over something, making enough noise to wake the sleeping clerks upstairs. Frederick Merrick, startled awake, grabbed a gun from beneath his pillow and tried to shoot Edward, but the weapon misfired. In the chaos, Merrick hurled a wooden stool at the intruders. Meanwhile, Gilbert Burroughs tackled William Dexter and began beating him furiously. When Merrick joined in the fight against Dexter, Edward and Jarvis rushed to help their partner. Edward fired a warning shot into the air, causing Burroughs to stop, but Merrick, undeterred, launched himself at Jarvis with renewed aggression. Edward fired another warning shot, but Merrick refused to back down. In that split second, Edward made a choice that would seal his fate. He aimed his gun directly at Frederick Merrick's head and pulled the trigger. Merrick died instantly. This murder was nothing like Edward's previous crimes, which he had committed in secret, always with a plan to cover his tracks. Frederick Merrick was killed during a robbery, in front of a witness, with no way to hide what had happened. In their panic, the three criminals tried to escape but missed the boat that was supposed to carry them across the Chenango River. Desperate, they attempted to swim the dangerous waters. Jarvis and Dexter, exhausted and weighed down by their clothes, began to drown. Edward managed to make it across, but his partners did not. Their bodies were discovered the next morning. Some speculated that Edward had let them drown on purpose, hoping to prevent them from being captured and testifying against him. The search for Frederick Merrick's killer was swift and thorough. Gilbert Burroughs gave the police detailed descriptions of the robbers, and patrols were quickly organized throughout Binghamton. Despite his years of experience evading capture, Edward made a critical mistake the next morning. When police officers approached him at the railroad station and asked for identification, he panicked and ran. He fled across the tracks to a nearby farm and hid in an outhouse, a humiliating end to his flight from justice. When he was finally caught, Edward gave false names, but his lies fooled no one. The most damning moment came when he was brought before the bodies of Jarvis and Dexter. Edward claimed he didn't know either man, but this denial was immediately exposed when Judge Ransom Balcom recognized him. "You are Edward H. Rulloff," the judge declared. "You murdered your wife and child in Lansing in 1845. Then the judge issued a warning. "This man understands his rights better than you do and will defend them to the last." Edward's trial began on January 4, 1871, and quickly became a media sensation. Crowds of 2,000 people gathered every day to watch the proceedings. Once again, Edward chose to represent himself, convinced that his superior legal knowledge could save him. The trial sparked heated debates about the relationship between genius and criminality. Some prominent figures, including newspaper editor Horace Greeley, argued that someone with Edward's intellectual gifts was too valuable to execute. no matter his crimes. Mark Twain even wrote a satirical response, offering to find someone else to confess to Edward's crimes and be executed in his place. Twain's biting critique exposed the absurdity of the idea that intelligence could excuse murder. On March 3, 1871, Edward was found guilty and sentenced to death. While awaiting execution, he finally confessed to killing his wife, Harriet, describing the crime in chilling detail. However, he never admitted to killing baby Priscilla, taking that secret with him to the grave. On May 18, 1871, Edward Howard Rulloff was executed before a crowd of nearly 2,000 spectators. His final words, whether they were, "Hurry it up, I want to be in hell in time for dinner," or simply, "I can't stand still," captured the same arrogant defiance that had defined his entire life. After his death, Edward's brain was removed and taken to Cornell University, where it was declared the largest human brain on record at the time. Professor Burt Wilder preserved it in a jar, where it remains to this day a haunting reminder of how brilliance can be twisted into evil. Edward Rulloff's story challenges everything we think we know about intelligence and morality. His massive brain, larger than Einstein's and nearly any genius in history, had the potential for revolutionary discoveries in linguistics and language. Instead, that same extraordinary mind planned and executed multiple murders with cold, calculated precision. The case of Edward Rulloff raises questions that still haunt us today. What is the true relationship between intelligence and morality? Can exceptional gifts ever excuse terrible crimes? How do we reconcile the capacity for both genius and evil within a single person? Edward's preserved brain, still sitting in its jar at Cornell University more than 150 years after his death, serves as a chilling reminder that intelligence without conscience doesn't create scholars or benefactors, it creates monsters. The mystery of what truly happened to baby Priscilla lingers even now. Did Edward really end her life, or did he send her away under a false identity, as some have speculated? The truth may never be known. What is certain is that Edward Howard Rulloff, a man with one of the largest brains ever recorded, used his extraordinary intellect not to uplift humanity, but to destroy it. His story stands as a stark warning. Brilliance without empathy can be the most dangerous force of all. Edward's legacy is not the scholarly acclaim he so desperately craved. Instead, it is a haunting lesson about the dark potential that lies within the human mind. His preserved brain, still floating in a jar at Cornell University, continues to provoke questions that have troubled scientists, philosophers, and criminologists for generations. If intelligence alone doesn't guarantee goodness, then what does? How do we ensure that our greatest minds are guided by conscience and compassion, rather than arrogance and cruelty? The story of Edward Rulloff is a chilling reminder that the people we trust and admire can sometimes be hiding the darkest secrets. He looked like a teacher, a scholar, a man of refinement. He could quote Latin and Greek, debate philosophy, and charm almost anyone he met. But beneath that polished exterior was a man capable of unimaginable violence and deception. He manipulated everyone around him, family, friends, colleagues, and even the legal system itself, always believing he was smarter than those who tried to hold him accountable. His crimes were not just acts of violence, but demonstrations of his belief in his own superiority. He saw himself as above the law, above morality, above the ordinary rules that govern society. Even in his final moments, standing on the gallows, he refused to show remorse or humility. Instead, he faced death with the same cold arrogance that had defined his life, leaving behind a legacy that continues to disturb and fascinate. Edward's case also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of genius. We often celebrate intelligence as an unqualified good, a trait that leads to progress and enlightenment. But Rulloff's life shows us that intellect, when divorced from empathy and ethical grounding, can become a weapon. His mind, capable of great discoveries, was also capable of great evil. The same analytical skills that could have advanced human knowledge were instead used to plan and execute crimes with chilling precision. The fascination with Edward Rulloff's brain is not just about its size, but about what it represents. Scientists hoped that by studying it, they might unlock the secrets of genius or, perhaps, understand the roots of criminality. Yet, after more than a century, the brain remains a symbol of unanswered questions. Can we ever truly understand what drives someone to use their gifts for harm rather than good? Is there a way to predict or prevent such tragedies? Or are we forever at the mercy of the unpredictable interplay between intellect and morality? For those who study crime and human behavior, Rulloff's story is a case study in the dangers of unchecked brilliance. It reminds us that intelligence is not a safeguard against evil, and that the most terrifying monsters can sometimes wear the most respectable faces. His life and crimes continue to inspire debate, research, and even art, as people try to make sense of how such a mind could go so far astray. In the end, Edward Howard Rulloff's life is a cautionary tale. It warns us not to mistake intelligence for virtue, and not to assume that those who speak well or think deeply are incapable of terrible acts. It challenges us to look beyond appearances and to remember that true greatness is measured not just by the power of the mind, but by the strength of the heart. So, as you reflect on the story of the genius killer, remember that the line between brilliance and madness, between genius and monstrosity, can be dangerously thin. The next time you hear about a prodigy or a celebrated intellect, consider the lessons of Edward Rulloff. Intelligence, without empathy and conscience, can become humanity's most dangerous combination. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating and disturbing criminal minds. If you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the dark corners of human nature. Until next time, remember, it's not just intelligence that shapes our world, but the choices we make with it.